Welcome to Theology Talks. In today's video, we're diving into a fascinating exploration of LGBTQ+ identities in the ancient world, a time when labels like homosexual or heterosexual didn't exist, and love was simply a personal matter. From the revered non-binary clergy of Mesopotamia to the cherished tales of the cut sleeve in China, join us as we uncover how ancient cultures embraced diverse expressions of gender and love long before modern distinctions took hold. Let's delve into the rich tapestry of history and rediscover the timeless acceptance that shaped human relationships for centuries. LGBTQ+ in the ancient world. In ancient cultures, there was no need for terms like LGBTQ+ because no distinction was made between what we now call homosexual and heterosexual relationships. There wasn't an us versus them mentality that called for labels. It was simply us, and who someone chose to love was their own business. The only stigma regarding male-male romantic relationships involved one's status and that of their partner. In Greece, Rome, and other cultures, if a freeman played the woman in a relationship, it was seen as a loss of manhood, but the relationship itself wasn't questioned. Ancient writers rarely mentioned someone's sexual orientation unless it was relevant to an event, as sexual identity wasn't an issue. In Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, same-sex relationships were so common that they were depicted alongside opposite-sex ones in art and literature. Scholar Bruce L. Garrick notes, "Lovemaking was a natural activity, not to be belittled. It could be practiced freely as long as no one was harmed or prohibitions broken, like bans on certain days or with women reserved for the gods." William Nafee also notes that in the ancient Near East, few cultures showed any significant moral concern about same-sex activities. Most seemed to accept that males might have sexual relations with other males. Distinctions around sexual identity and prohibitions on same-sex relationships emerged with Christianity, which rejected practices tied to earlier religious beliefs. It wasn't same-sex relationships being condemned, but non-Christian activities, like pagan worship or attending non-Christian festivals. Even the terms homosexual and heterosexual didn't exist until 1869. The Greek term arsenokoites, translated as homosexuals in the Bible for the first time in 1946, didn't appear until St. Paul coined it in 1 Timothy 1 verse 10 and 1 Corinthians 6 verse 9. Its literal translation is male beds, likely referring to men engaging in non-Christian traditions rather than same-sex relationships. The irony of today's debate over sexual identity is that for over 2,000 years, same-sex relationships were traditionally accepted, respected, and even celebrated. Mesopotamia. In ancient Mesopotamia, the priests and priestesses of the goddess Inanna, better known as Ishtar, were bisexual and transgender. Inanna's power to transform men into women and vice versa was considered awe-inspiring. Her father god, Enki, was believed to have created a third gender, neither male nor female, who served Inanna as clergy. What is now called non-binary was recognized over 3,000 years ago as a divinely created third gender. Same-sex relationships were also blessed by the gods, as shown in the Almanac of Incantations, which included prayers for both same-sex and opposite-sex couples. A man who had sex with someone of his own status was believed to bring prosperity, while relationships between people of different statuses were thought to bring trouble, whether same-sex or opposite sex. This idea of status over sex was common across many ancient cultures. China. In ancient China, upper-class men and monarchs often took male lovers from their courtiers. This was seen as acceptable since the higher status lover would ennoble the lower status beloved. Records of male same-sex relationships in China date back to at least 600 BCE, with more frequent mentions in poems, anecdotes, and histories from the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 220 CE. Female same-sex relationships were generally ignored in the same way that women were often overlooked by male historians. Male couples were associated with the ennobling power of love, where both individuals were elevated by their connection. Scholar Lewis Crompton notes, "These normative tales show an unself-conscious acceptance of same-sex relations that persisted in China for 24 centuries. They contrast sharply with Western myths like the story of Sodom and are distinct from ancient Greece's traditions, which emphasized heroic self-sacrifice." Instead, China's tales focus on delicate tenderness. One such story, The Cut Sleeve, tells of Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty, Art 7 to 1 BC, who, while resting with his lover Dong Xian, cut off his sleeve rather than wake him when he needed to leave for court. The phrase cut sleeve became a reference to same-sex relationships, alongside other stories that highlighted the care a lover had for their beloved. Japan. Same-sex relationships in Japan, particularly during the pre-Meiji period, 800-1868 CE, were also considered ennobling and even encouraged by the great Buddhist sage Kukai. Kukai, better known as Kobo Daisher, founded Shingon Buddhism in Japan around 806 CE and remains a revered figure. Although he is often credited with introducing same-sex relationships to Japan, they were acknowledged much earlier. The Japanese referred to these relationships as nanshoku, love of males, or male colors. These relationships were legitimized by the aristocracy and the literate elite, who were influenced by Chinese models. In Japan, romantic and sexual attachments were seen as natural, regardless of whether the attraction was toward the same sex or the opposite. In the famous novel The Tale of Genji, circa 1020 CE, the hero seduces the younger brother of the woman he is courting, but his bisexuality is of so little concern to the author that it is never mentioned again. Egypt. In ancient Egypt, fluid gender identity was recognized throughout its history, and like other cultures, it was not condemned unless a male of high social status played the part of the woman's during sex. Scholar Colin Spencer notes, male bisexuality was accepted as natural, but passive homosexuality made Egyptians uneasy, especially when a king displayed feminine traits. While Egyptians respected feminine power, as shown by their many powerful female deities, they did not believe mortal women could effectively wield it, though many did, with Hatshepsut being a notable example. There was no concept of a homosexual relationship in Egypt, just relationships. When male-male sexual relations were mentioned negatively, it was about one man surrendering his masculine power to another, not about the relationship itself. In the famous tale of the contending of Horus and Set, for instance, the gods were concerned not with the sexual act but with Set's claim that he dominated Horus. The cult of the Phrygian goddess Cybele and her consort Attis flourished in ancient Greece around 300 BCE, featuring the Galli, transgender clergy who identified as female. This cult likely originated in Mesopotamia and was influenced by the earlier cult of Inanna and her clergy. However, long before 300 BCE, same-sex relationships were already common in Greece. Plato praised male-male relationships in many of his dialogues, but later, in his final work Laws, he seemed to criticize the strong emotions these relationships could provoke. Aristotle didn't concern himself with same-sex relationships, except when a man took on a passive role, which was seen as surrendering masculinity. Zeno of Citium, the Stoic philosopher, exclusively favored male relationships. A classic model in Greece was the bond between an older man, the erastes or lover, and a youth, the ereminos or beloved, where the youth would be mentored and cultivated. In Sparta, male-male relationships were encouraged in their education program, as it was believed that lovers would fight harder to protect each other. This idea was famously proven by the Sacred Band of Thebes, a troupe of same-sex lovers undefeated in battle until their final stand in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. In ancient Rome, the model was similar to Greece, where an older man, established in society, formed a relationship with a youth who would benefit from the connection. The sexual aspect was considered less important, and for the relationship to be deemed honorable, there had to be mutual affection and respect. Married Roman men often had affairs with male lovers, and the only dishonor lay in a man of standing taking a passive role during sex, specifically in anal intercourse. Julius Caesar is known to have had same-sex relationships, and while some tried to tarnish his reputation for allegedly being passive, his accomplishments as a warrior and statesman outweighed any such attempts. One of the most famous same-sex relationships in Roman history was between Emperor Hadrian and his young lover Antinous, though many other such relationships existed, even if they were never recorded by historians. Gender identification in other ancient cultures. These same social structures existed in many other ancient cultures. In Thailand, a third gender known as the cat hoi, or lady boys, has been recognized since at least the 14th century CE, though they likely existed earlier. In India, the Manusmriti law code from around 1250 BCE treated same-sex and opposite-sex relationships equally. Both this work and the Kama Sutra mention a third gender, the Kinnar or Hijra. Though these groups are marginalized today, ancient texts do not stigmatize them, and unlike other cultures, there was no loss of status for third-gender individuals playing a passive role. Native American tribes recognized a third gender, known today as two-spirit, who embodied both male and female traits. The original term for this identity was lost due to the European colonization of the Americas, and two-spirit is a modern designation. These individuals were highly valued within their communities, believed to be transformed by the gods, much like followers of Inanna and Cybele. During the vision quest, a rite of passage to manhood, a boy might be visited by a deity and shown his true self. If chosen as a two-spirit, he would return to the tribe, dress as a woman, and take on tasks traditionally performed by women. In Africa, there are various terms for people who identified or self-identified as a third gender. Among them are the Ashtaim, men who identified as women and performed women's work, similar to the two-spirit of Native America. Many of these individuals married men and, although marginalized today like the Kinnar and Cat Hoi, they were once recognized as divinely transformed beings. Conclusion. The first significant shift away from this acceptance of gender diversity came with the rise of Christianity and its intolerance of other faiths and earlier practices. After Christianity was embraced by the Roman Empire following Constantine's conversion, its beliefs were seen as absolute truth, leaving no room for alternate narratives. However, the Bible itself does not condemn same-sex relationships and does not address third genders. Leviticus 18 verse 22, which is often cited against LGBTQ+ individuals today, speaks only to a man's playing the part of a woman in sex, an idea also present in many ancient cultures, and it does not refer to same-sex relationships in general. Similarly, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from Genesis, often used in anti-LGBTQ+ arguments, was understood by early church fathers like Saint Ambrose to be about breaking hospitality rules, not sexual identity. Another misinterpreted passage, Romans 1 verses 24 to 27, warns of people engaging in pagan rituals like sacred orgies and prostitution, but again, it has nothing to do with condemning sexual identity. Any Bible translations suggesting otherwise misrepresent the text. Same-sex relationships in the above cultures were initially impacted by Christian missionaries and, later, by the spread of other religions such as Islam and even Buddhism, which once encouraged same-sex relationships. This intolerance stems from ignorance and fear, perpetuated by societies clinging to what they see as traditional values without recognizing that the most fundamental values are love and respect. As Spencer notes, sexuality exists in all its depth and complexity, no matter how society tries to control it. Some might say it's the greatest force within us, perhaps explaining our fear of it and the attempts to subjugate and tame it, often when it's unnecessary. Uncontrolled sex is linked in our minds to barbarism, the decay of civilization, and perhaps even our own evolution. For centuries, society has reserved its strongest moral condemnation for unorthodox sexual behavior. Imagine the different history we could have had if morals focused on how humane and tolerant a society was, instead of fixating on how we experience an orgasm. The LGBTQ+ community remained marginalized for nearly 2,000 years until the latter part of the 20th century when individuals began asserting their right to live in accordance with their sexual identities. In the US, the Stonewall Rebellion on June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village was a turning point, sparking the LGBTQ+ movement to demand civil rights. The courage shown by those at Stonewall, who stood up against an unjust legal system that kept them marginalized, inspired others around the world to demand the same acceptance that had once been freely given by ancient cultures.